So in most of the videos that I've made for the team policy topic, I've talked about negative approaches. In this one, I want to talk a little bit about affirmative approaches. My philosophy, what to do through the season if you wanted to win a lot on the affirmative, there were a few things you had to do. The first thing was, once you'd settled on an affirmative, especially the person who was the 2AC, but to a certain measure, both members of the team really needed to read every single article and know all the facts backward and forward. You think of yourself as kind of defending a citadel, and you need to never be taken by surprise. Any argument that the negative makes that's based in research, you should never find out in the middle of a round that that article is out there. You want to make sure you've tracked down every single article if you possibly can. That's a first principle, but in a more concrete fashion, what I mostly advised my debaters to do at the beginning of the season was try to find an affirmative that had a fairly big impact, but also didn't link to a whole lot. Now that may sound like, well, yeah, I would love to do that. How do you do that? One of the best ways to do that is to find an area in which current efforts are underway but are some way dysfunctional, and then just fix them. If you fix them, then you can make the argument that right now resources are being wasted, right now people are being deployed, right now attention is being paid, all of that is happening, so all of that should trigger their disadvantage links. All you do is shift it into something that works. So the negative's disadvantage link, the only thing that's different, the only thing you change, is you go from ineffective to effective, and they then have to win a disadvantage link off you being effective, which means that they have to concede, effectively, they have to concede your solvency, if you do it right. So here are a couple of possible approaches that might help you to do this. I think you could, first of all, this is something I would look into. I think you ought to look into current efforts to respond to the potential swine flu pandemic. Now, that got a lot of coverage earlier in the year, and a lot of people took it seriously for a while and then wrote it off because it didn't materialize in quite the way it had been reported. And I have to tell you, that is more a fault in the reporting than it is a fault in the science and the preparation that went into the concern about swine flu in the first place. If you study what happened with the Spanish influenza pandemic back in the 19-teens, back around the time of World War I, it really did surface as something very mild, go away through a summer season, and then when cold and flu season came back, it hit like a sledgehammer. So, if you go out and cut the cards, I think you can make the case. Swine flu is still with us. We may have misunderstood it, but it is very dangerous. And the number of deaths that it could pile up, really without having to research that far, I think that you could make this a pretty formidable case as far as significance and harm. Well, what should the plan do? Well, for that, you're going to have to go and find what people are writing about current efforts, why the current efforts are misguided, why our current priorities are wrong, why the way we're preparing right now isn't going to work, and then see what proposals you can find in literature. And the plan that you'll write will be just take what we've already laid out and fix it. Take the priorities we've already set, which are misplaced, and recalibrate those priorities so that we respond to the risk of pandemic flu in a more rational way. Now, the one last question you may be asking is, well, is that topical? That doesn't really sound to me like environmental policy. Isn't that public health policy? And I have a couple of answers to this. The first is that stockpiling medical supplies, that raises a huge issue of medical waste to begin with. So if it's going to be a matter of where do we distribute our medical supplies in case of pandemic, that is an environmental policy in and of itself, because as those things are used, you have to figure out where to dispose them. That may be a little bit of a stretch. What I think is your core argument to defend this as environmental policy is, in the case of pandemic outbreak of swine flu, think about how it's spread. One of the reasons that it's a public health danger, and one of the reasons that you have to take such harsh measures to contain it, is that it's spread through things like sneezing. Sneezing is air pollution. I mean, if you're going to treat human waste, human fecal matter in drinking water as a pollution problem, and I think most people would say, yeah, that's right up the middle of groundwater pollution, it's one of the biggest groundwater pollution issues that exists, then why would spreading disease through human fluids, why would that be any different? That seems to me to go in exactly the same category. So I don't think you would have too hard of a time defending that as an environmental policy. So another approach to taking status quo efforts and moving them from kind of irrational to a set of better priorities so that you have kind of a big impact available but you don't link to a lot, what I think you could do, this would take a ton of research. This would just be a monster as far as card cutting, but go investigate the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act, people will always bellyache about the way that it's handled. You will always, year after year, find people who are unhappy and who have proposals, ways they think that it could be done more effectively. So, if you dig into that literature, your harm is that we are losing endangered species. Now, around the 1970s and the 1980s, there were a lot of books written and wonderful, wonderful impact cards talking about what happened if we let species become extinct. Arguments like there's somewhere out there is a keystone species that effectively is like the 13th rivet on an airplane wing, and when this keystone species becomes extinct, then that'll cascade through the food chain and could lead to extinction of all life on the planet. I mean, when I was a high school and college debater, one of the ideas we sort of carried around with us was if they want a species extinction impact, it was one of the few things that people were carrying evidence that outweighed a nuclear war. So, if you go looking for what are the consequences of species extinction, and in particular habitat loss, and if you can find a good proposal for how to reform the Endangered Species Act, how to handle it more rationally, and you can find very good cards that you can explain very easily saying this is a better approach, this is more effectively going to save endangered species, then I think you've got an affirmative that wouldn't necessarily link to a whole lot. The one downside is, if anybody who's in your region, anybody you're likely to debate, if they really love to cut cards, they can get into the literature about the Endangered Species Act, and there's no shortage of it. Tons and tons and tons of journal articles are written about it. Even entire books are written about it, and they can surprise you by having done a very, very thorough case hit on the Endangered Species Act. And they may have case-specific counterplans and case-specific case turns and so forth. So if you are going to be on top of why your proposal is the best way to fix how the Endangered Species Act is administered, you're going to have to do a lot of reading specifically about the Endangered Species Act, and that may trade off with your negative preparation. So there's a little bit of a price there. The reason I think that's less true with pandemic swine flu is just because that issue has not been around nearly as long, so the literature base hasn't built up quite as large. It's not as easy to defend as far as being topical, and you have to overcome possibly some of your judges will have a little bit of skepticism because they may have bought into sort of the problems with the media reporting of it and turning it into a panic and then the panic being deflated. But those are all things I think that you can overcome when you get into the literature. So the big picture that I started with, the big idea that I started with is you want to have an affirmative that you understand more about than anybody else. And it's a really good idea if it's something with a big impact but the plan doesn't do a lot. I would call that, and I have for a lot of years called that, your anchor affirmative. You run it at the beginning of the year, you have a whole lot of debates on it, you get to where you know it backwards and forwards, and there really are no surprises. But then throughout the year, you want to have a few satellite affirmatives. You want to have a few little affirmatives. An affirmative that doesn't claim a lot, doesn't really have a lot of significance, but doesn't really do a lot, and is very difficult for the negative to get a link to. An affirmative that is just in some way creative, something that they didn't see coming. And those you use in specific debates. Maybe you get into the elimination rounds and you're debating someone who's just been a thorn in your side all year, so you throw them off their guard for one round with a new affirmative that they didn't see coming. But when you've always got the old, straight up the middle of the topic, the old reliable, the affirmative that you know really well and feel really comfortable with, and you can throw in a few surprises, that's a combination that I think is a good approach to affirmative wins that are sustainable throughout the year. So, give that a shot.